As part of my role in community relations for the coalition, I have the opportunity to travel around the state and talk to folks. If you've ever attended one of my speaking engagements, you'll know that I tend to focus on two things: the role of and services provided by WVCEH, and the demonstrable facts about homelessness in this state. Now, whether I'm providing an official presentation on the topic or just strike up a more casual conversation with a community member, there are a few questions and talking points that almost always get brought up. One of those being shelter access. These conversations have led me to a few realizations. The first being, everyone claims to want a shelter in their community. The second, no one wants a shelter on their street in said community. And third, not many folks really understand how the shelter system works. And that's not a diss, because the final realization was that I, myself, also had some learning to do in terms of shelter operations and distribution throughout the regions we serve. There are a few different directions that I considered taking in putting together this episode. Ultimately, I decided to start with a system level overview since we happen to have a resident expert on staff. In the future, if there is interest, I may see if I can interview some folks actively operating shelters around the state to provide a better understanding of day-to-day life and operations within such a facility. But that's a consideration for another time. Here with me today is Jessica, Chief Financial Compliance Officer for the West Virginia Coalition to End Homelessness. Jess, thank you so much for being here with me today. If you don't mind, would you care to introduce yourself and share a little bit about how you got into this line of work?
Sure. I'm happy to be here today. Let's see. I am married. I have a daughter. I enjoy the outdoors. And over the years, I have spent a lot of time in social work, like positions and jobs. But what's interesting about this one is that when I was an undergrad at Marshall University studying social work, my final internship was actually approved to be at Harmony House, which is an agency in Huntington that serves the homeless population in the area. So I did an internship there. And then years later in grad school at WVU, when looking for another placement, my field instructor decided to mention to me about the West Virginia Coalition to End Homelessness and that it might be a good fit for me based on my previous experience in Huntington. So I took it. I didn't have a desire at the time to go into this type of work. I had no idea what I wanted to do. But with his prompting and his suggestion, I went there and started my internship. So that's how I became part of this agency and specifically working within the field of addressing homelessness.
So you kind of fell into this. Yes. I think that's really fun. Can you kind of talk about your role and how it plays in with the shelter systems within our COC?
Yes. So back in, I think it was 2019, the Department of Human Services, which at the time was still DHHR, so we've since had a name change, they have funding specifically for homeless services. And because that funding was allocated well before continuums of care were established, which, are the ones who are tasked with ending and preventing homelessness in their catchment area, they decided to bid it out to one of the 4 COCs in the state. Given that the balance of state COC is the largest and we had the capacity, we were given this grant. And so I stepped into that role because we had to hire someone to take on overseeing that grant and working with the shelters. So I moved into the position at the time was titled Shelter Policy Director. And that's how I began my work, learning specifically about this funding, talking with all the funded shelters across the state, gathering information, and then we've just slowly evolved from there and keep making improvements year to year.
Okay, so I know one of the big questions that normally gets asked is, how many funded shelters are located either within our COC or within the state in general? Is that something that you could speak to?
Yes. So when I first took on this role, there were 10 contracted shelters around the state. There were also a few missions or shelters, mostly missions, that received some voucher funding, which was essentially funding from the department for bed nights. So there are now currently 13 funded shelters through this specific funding across the state. And we took those agencies that were receiving just funding for bed nights, and we included them in what we now do as a competition for funding. And so we've kind of gotten away from just the voucher for the bed nights into, if you want to receive this funding, you're part of the competition. And so we have now 13 total.
And are there differences in the operations or standard of operations between a funded shelter, a shelter that's receiving COC funding versus maybe just a facility that's opening up like an overnight stay facility? Is there a demonstrable difference there, or what are we looking at there?
When you say overnight, are you just meaning a seasonal shelter or a nightly one?
Yeah, so a lot of our community members, when they talk about shelters, right, they may not know how to kind of go about the funding process and becoming like a funded partner, which we'll get into a little bit later. But there have been like a few different churches or community groups who have maybe put out cots in a community center or in another building. And I know those tend not to have the same level of oversight potentially as a funded shelter. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I would say the main difference is, and just to clarify, this funding is Department of Human Services funding that flows through the coalition. Just to make that clear for anyone listening, that this is not COC funding, but it does flow through us. So any shelter, I would argue, should follow the same standards and the same best practices and what we know from the fields of thought and study over the past however many years. That should be how I would say that any shelter should be conducted or operated. So with the funding, we do that, right? So the Department for Human Services has a specific policy for this homeless services funding that is mostly for shelters. So we have to follow that if you're receiving funding. And we have these subgrants through us to shelters, and we have expectations for HMIS participation, which is our data system. We have expectations for collecting, performance measures. We look more at outcomes. In the past, a lot of shelters only looked at outputs. So like widgets, like how many meals did we serve? How many bed nights were, provided to people throughout the year? But that didn't actually tell us what was happening. So we're looking at how many people are being served, but also how long are they staying in the shelter? Where are they going when they leave? So we're looking at specific outcomes. So that's part of the funding expectation. There are specific ways to do intake and how to do case management and really focus on the housing piece. So housing-led conversations, being trauma-informed, having the strengths-based approach. So that's all a very big expectation of the funded shelters, although I would argue that should be the expectation for everyone. But a lot of the other missions that have been in operation for so long, they come from the faith-based charity mindset. So they might have different goals or different missions for the folks that are staying in their place, and they might have a program expectation. So what their shelters or missions look like is different, because we're always looking at getting folks out as quickly as possible, getting them into housing with supports. Many of the other ones might be more of a graduation process or a completing of a program process. And then, of course, you have your seasonal shelters, which definitely open up specifically when it's cold outside, which are very much needed, and we appreciate them. Unfortunately, the Department of Human Services funding cannot be used for seasonal shelters. We're looking at funding year-round 24-hour shelters. So we're grateful for those. And I would say the cold weather shelters, the goal is still to get in there and talk with folks and get them into housing before that season of coldness ends. But a lot of times the goal is just to get people in from the cold, make sure they have food and a warm place to stay. So we are trying to work with everyone to make sure we're capturing that data, we're capturing who's experiencing homelessness, and then working to move them into housing still, because we don't want to end up at the end of that seasonal shelter and everyone just has to go back outside.
Right. And thank you for explaining kind of the differentiation between those three separate categories. It kind of segues perfectly into our next point. And I wanted to highlight something that you said about the funded shelters, because I think it's something really interesting and I think it's a huge misconception. I know that in the past, and it's still a common belief amongst the community, shelter success being measured by this idea of just heads in beds. But you pretty succinctly debunked that and said that now to receive that funding, we have really moved to a model of ultimate housing readiness and housing outcomes post-shelter, rather than just success being measured by the number of heads in beds on a given week, night, month, whatever it may be. So one of the questions kind of leaning into that we often hear from our community members are concerns about some of the common issues in regards to funding that you may hear from a shelter. So could you walk us through, in terms of either receiving or maintaining funding, some of the common issues that you are hearing from the shelters operating within our state?
Yes. The number one issue is that there's never enough money. And that's the reality. So when you're looking at federal or state funding, it is very limited. I know with our state, we have the Emergency Solutions Grant, which will fund shelters, but they also look to spread that out over the state. So a lot of times grantees will receive a portion of funding, but not enough to actually hire staff or do what they need to do effectively. With the Department of Human Services, it's the same way. We have a lump sum of money, and in the grand scheme of things, it is not high up on their priority list. It's really a small piece of funding with the department. I don't know if that funding is going to increase at any point.
Right.
So we're dealing with a very set amount of money, and we're trying to spread that money out across the regions, because we would like to see funded shelters in every region of the state. But the reality is there are more populated areas that actually need more shelter space because the population is greater based on our point in time count. So I would say overall, yes, that just the overall funding in general is limited. It's so important for shelter programs, agencies that have shelters, to diversify funding and get other funding. And I know that can be difficult. We've seen people reach out to their city, their county, United Way, any other funding you can get, even if it's, we know when we're serving those experiencing homelessness, we're dealing with a lot of different things from substance use to mental health issues. So there are other grants you could apply for to hire staff specific to maybe that one area, but yet it's being used for the shelter. So it's really important for shelters to understand that this one pot of money is not going to fully fund your shelter and provide all the staffing that you need. That's the reality. So I think that's the number one issue I've heard and I know is an issue, because it would be nice to have just one amount of money you get and it can fund your entire shelter for the full year and all your staff, but that's just not the reality. And I would say the other issues that I've heard, because we are on a reimbursement basis, some of the funds can be delayed. So for the coalition to receive our grant from the department, it's on a pay schedule. We have to submit an invoice. We receive the funds after it goes through their approval process. That could be delayed. So therefore, we're delayed getting our funds. And then the shelters are on a reimbursement basis. So they'll submit for what they spent the previous month. So they have to have the funds ahead of time to cover, let's say, May's expenses. And then by June 15th, they're submitting to say, hey, here's all the money we spent in the shelter and we need reimbursed. And so that's a process to review everything, get that submitted to our finance department and then have those checks sent out. So sometimes it could become a cash flow issue with us here at the coalition, and then it becomes a cash flow issue often with the shelters. So if they are larger agencies, they have more money to work with. But if they're smaller, it can be really difficult when they get into a tight crunch with the cash flow.
Absolutely, I could imagine. And in your time and in your experience, what was the most drastic delay that you think you've seen? Are we talking matters of weeks? Are we talking matters of months?
I would say the most drastic delay we've seen is the fiscal year starts July 1st, and I believe the 1 year we did not receive our grant agreement from the department until October.
Oh, wow.
So we're already into Q2, and then we have to get the sub-grants out. So a lot of folks did not get reimbursed for July, August, September, not even starting to until maybe November or December. That was our most drastic year. It has not been that bad since. And then what's also difficult is the transition from the end of the fiscal year and then the start of a new fiscal year. Because by the end of June, they're submitting for their June reimbursement in July. July 1 starts a new fiscal year. And if they don't have their sub-grant signed yet, if we don't have our grant from the department and then they don't have their sub-grants, the shelters cannot start to request reimbursement. So sometimes that's delayed a few months. So I'd say that's the toughest time there as well.
Okay, so fiscally and funding wise, it sounds like bureaucracy is one of the largest issues that they're facing.
It's the trickle down, and it's the many steps for the approval process, especially at the state level.
Right. Okay. So kind of a parrot of the earlier question, but taking a slightly different angle on it. We had a few community members who were interested in knowing, in terms of operation, what some of the biggest issues were. You had mentioned kind of as we were kicking this off that there are certain stipulations to receiving this money in terms of the way that a shelter may operate or the practices that they have in place. So in your work with working with these shelters and getting them to a place where they can receive funding, where they can at least be competitive in that process, what are some of the biggest operational issues that you're hearing from folks?
I think I'll answer this in two parts. The first part will be operational issues that I'm hearing from folks. So the number one thing would be, as we strive to lower barriers to enter shelter, a lot of shelter providers find it difficult to find that balance between how do I offer lower barrier services, but also hold people accountable for behaviors and make sure that our staff are safe and the folks we serve are safe. And I think that's the number one struggle across the board. There are so many trainings that we provide, and I definitely am happy to talk through specific situations with any provider. But I think overall, this is one of the hardest things for shelter providers to really grasp, because it used to be there were very strict rules, and if you broke that rule, you're out. And so most of the folks in the shelter were experiencing homelessness, but they were lower acuity. So there were many things they could do, and they were volunteering at the shelter, and there were no behavioral issues, and they were following all the rules. But they're falling very low on our prioritization guide for housing. And the folks who are higher acuity and really needing that shelter space, more likely to die outside, they weren't able to be in the shelter. So now that we're shifting that, it's an expectation that you're not denying someone access to shelter based on specific things. But then, okay, so if I'm now allowing you into shelter, then how do we mitigate all the issues and the behaviors that could arise? I think that's very difficult. And we know across the board, it's difficult when you take the people that have, mental health, substance use, behavioral issues, and just put them all in the same room. Like, that's going to create conflict. So that's one of the biggest issues we've seen. I would say data entry and case management is always a struggle. I think some folks in the past, it was a very planned out regimen of we're going to do this, then this, then this, but we really want to look at a strengths-based approach and working with the individual on their goals and what we need to work on with them first, rather than just our basic, okay, we're going to find you a job and we're going to do this. So it's shifting that mindset of like, you have to do it this way to let's work with you where you're at and what your goals are, what your strengths are, with the ultimate goal being housing, because there's a lot of things that can be worked on continuously once they're in housing. So I think the lower barrier idea and how to carry that out is an issue and a concern and frustration, I think, for a lot of providers that we continue to train on. Case management, and then the struggle with housing, because we are looking at performance measures. So we are looking at how long are they staying in the shelter and how quickly are they exiting to positive housing destinations. And a lot of times, because we're looking at those things and it does affect their scoring and their funding potentially, the frustration is, well, we don't have enough housing, or we don't have housing. We don't have landlords willing to work with us. And that's the struggle everywhere. So it's hard to communicate that these are still the standards and the performance measures that we're looking at. We know it's a struggle everywhere. But how are we working with our area, our community? How are we being creative? How are we looking for additional funding in order to continue to move towards those goals and have better data and better performance measures? So that's a huge struggle, because I think a lot of times folks are like, well, I shouldn't be held to that standard because it's harder in my area. But the reality is that HUD sets standards for our COC competition too, and we're beholden to those, regardless if it's hard. So that's something I really wish more shelter providers understood, is that we still have performance measures we have to look at and report on, and we distribute funding based off of a lot of these things. And so we know it's not perfect, and there's not a set time frame. We're not looking at shelters and saying they have to be out in so many days, but it's basically everyone's scoring themselves against themselves, right? It's their report card. So year to year, are they working to increase or improve their measures? So that's something that I think is an operational issue, because a lot of times we're providing a space for people to be, and we're providing food, and we're mitigating crises, and we're putting out fires. And I think it's really easy to get in the weeds. And so I'm really trying to work closely with shelter providers to look at how do we do the day-to-day, but then how do we also look monthly or quarterly at everything internally to start making strategic and proactive decisions for moving forward. Because if not, we'll just stay in the same space, same operations year to year.
Right. And I'm so glad that you explained it in such a way. Because one of the myths that I find myself often having to bust when I'm talking to folks is this idea or this concept that these stipulations and these regulations are set by us, by the West Virginia Coalition on Homelessness, or they're set by the COC side of the coalition, that we are the ones kind of setting these regulatory standards. And I think it is a healthy reminder that these are HUD standards that we ourselves are also completely beholden to. We don't get to play with the rules in that way. And I'm also really glad that you touched on the importance of, that low barrier entry. I think it is important to keep in mind that that's a matter of saving lives, not a matter of just like us trying to virtue signal to providers. But it truly is a matter of saving lives of individuals who would otherwise pass away on the streets. So thank you for that explanation. That was incredibly succinct, Jess. I can tell why you are the professional in this.
No.
And so we've touched on two different angles of concerns that a provider themselves might experience, both from the funding side and from the operational side. The third question is looking more at participants. This is a huge one. I'm sure you've heard it. Listeners, I'm sure you have all heard this, and many of you may have asked this question yourselves. Why might someone not want to go to a shelter. I hear that all the time, especially in communities where there are operational funded shelters. You'll always have somebody say, well, I offered to take them and they just outright refused, so they must not need the help. And that's always the tagline that comes at the end of that question. So, Jess, while we have you here, the expert in the room, could you maybe speak to some of the reasons why an individual might choose not to go to a shelter?
Yes, so there are many reasons, and this is why it's so important to be receiving on the regular active feedback from the individuals you're serving, and not just flippantly. And I know that we can look at different ways, but it's really important to say, let's look at our operations, let's look at our policies. What would make this better? And to talk with folks in the community about what would prompt you to go to a shelter? Like currently you don't want to, but what would? And so I think it's really important that we receive that feedback from persons with lived or living experience. Because if we're the ones providing the service to them, they're the ones needing it, then why wouldn't we try to make changes for what they're actually needing? So a lot of the things that I've heard is, okay, a curfew. So if you have a curfew, it's one thing to check in, make sure you're still coming in, but sometimes, most of the time, shelters are set up where you have to be in by a certain time and you can't leave until a certain time in the morning. A lot of people don't like to be confined to that. A lot of people maybe need to go out in the middle of the night. Maybe they do have active addiction. And we're saying you can't use here. Okay, but we're also not letting them leave the building to maybe use elsewhere in the middle of the night. So a lot of times they just decide to not come in. And I've talked with some folks who don't want to be confined. They think if something bad happens, I'm locked in this building. And you've got to understand that a lot of these folks are used to living outdoors. So they're used to being in the fresh air. They're used to being outside. So saying that they have to be in a building for X amount of hours, and if they leave, they don't get to come back, they're not going to come. Why do that? Another thing is that folks that are in active use, they might not use on the property, but sometimes they do. And sometimes they have paraphernalia and there's different things that happen. And so the shelters will say they have to leave. Sometimes they don't agree with the program expectations. So if the rules, and I should say this differently, there are sometimes expectations, and we should be asking folks for consent to shelter to say, hey, if you come in here, here's the expectation, right? Here's what we're going to do, and here's what the goal is. So if they're wanting to come in and just live there forever, that's probably not going to match up. So a lot of times they might not come in because it's not going to be their home, versus other rules or expectations that are just, they feel like they're not going to be able to meet, or maybe the shelter is a little bit too strict with how they handle those rules. And so folks are like, well, I'm just not going to bother with that. Another issue would be other people. Some folks don't want to come into a space and be around that many people. They don't want to be in close proximity. They don't want to be around, like if someone's a non-smoker and they're in a shelter where it smells like smoke, they don't want to be in there. They might say they have allergies. I've heard many of these before. Like, I have allergies, or I have this, or I can't be around the people that have that. Some folks have animals, whether they're service animals or not. They have animals and they don't want to go into a shelter and then they don't know where their animal's going to go. Most shelters don't allow animals at all, even though they have to allow service animals. And then stigma. Sometimes I've talked with folks before that maybe haven't been outside and this is their first time becoming homeless, and they don't want to go to a shelter because of the stigma, or just their own, pride. Like, I've worked my entire life and now I'm in this situation. I'll never go to a shelter,
Right.
So there are a lot of different reasons why folks won't go to a shelter. And I'll just put this plug in. I was talking with someone the other day about backpacking, and she asked me what was the difference, or what I like better between just hiking versus backpacking. And I told her the really cool thing about backpacking is that you have everything with you that you need, and you're getting up every day and you're just walking. And I think a lot of folks that have been outside for a long time, they're used to that. They're used to getting up and walking. And after my backpacking trip, I'm actually sad the day that I have to wake up and it's not just keep walking. It's, you have to go to your car now and drive back home and go to work. It's depressing a little bit because, like, I just really enjoyed that. So I started thinking about that in regards to folks that are living outside, and they just want to stay in that. It's very, I don't know if the word's primal, I don't know, but there's just something different about being outdoors. And I know that we're working with folks and we really want to get them into housing, and they should have housing if they want it. A lot of folks just need to get there. And so they don't want to go to shelter yet. It's very different for them. And it's a lot. I mean, we struggle to have folks that are wanting to go into housing by themselves, to have their own space. So a lot of folks definitely don't want to go into shelter because it's a lot of people, it's a lot of rules, it's a lot of conflict, and they just would rather be outside.
It's a huge adjustment, huge adjustment. And I'm glad you humanized that in such a way, because as you were talking, I was thinking about myself. I would not operate well with a curfew. If there was someone I didn't know telling me what my bedtime was as an adult, oh, I'd probably be the problem child at any shelter I went to. I couldn't imagine. So that's a very humanized way of thinking about that. And just kind of as a quick side question, some of the low barrier practices that you're discussing are they things that are trying to help alleviate some of these participant brought concerns? Is that kind of the goal with those?
Yeah, so the main goal when we say lower barrier, we're basically saying we're not creating barriers for you to access shelter. So in the past, it was you have to have an ID, you have to be sober, you have to X, Y, or Z. So that's the first step, is just lowering barriers so that we're saying we're a shelter, you need shelter, and we're going to allow you to come in, and we're not going to create barriers. The next step of that would be then the ongoing, right? So we're going to continue to serve you even if you're in active addiction. We do have an expectation you don't use here. You don't deal drugs here. However, they should still be able to use. How do we work with that? And then what was the other thing? Curfews, just talking with folks to say, okay, if so-and-so, if you're telling them you can't use here on site, but then they're in the bathroom using, and you quote unquote catch them using in the bathroom, why are they, like, let's get to the bottom of like, why? Is it because there's a curfew where they're not allowed to leave the building at 1 a.m. to go outside and use, to go off the property to use? So that's something we need to adjust, because if we can adjust our rules, then we're still providing the necessary service, and we're not creating these barriers to then refuse service, or, to tell folks, well, you can't stay here anymore.
Right.
So yes, that's the whole lower barrier model, is that we're decreasing barriers to access shelter, and we're decreasing barriers to continue to receive shelter services and work towards housing.
Right, because along with the obvious, which we mentioned earlier, which was the immediate life-saving service that shelters provide, you've also been really hitting on the fact that shelter is really only a step. And the ultimate goal is stable housing at the end. And how are we setting someone up for stable housing if we are refusing them service at a resource facility, at a shelter, because they wanted to go smoke a cig at 1 a.m.? I can see that. I understand kind of what you're proposing with that. And I know that there are a lot of community members who, if it was explained in this way, I think you've done a very fantastic job at humanizing all of this. And there may be community members out there today who are considering what it would look like to have a funded shelter in their community. They may be talking with their city officials about this, or maybe a faith-based organization that they want to partner with. If there was such a group listening in right now, and they were interested in establishing a shelter that received these funds, what does that process look like?
Some of the things you've already touched on, but I would say, number one, let's get an accurate count. Who's in your community that's actually experiencing homelessness? Let's get a count. So if providers are already using HMIS, they can begin capturing that data. If not, I would encourage them to start utilizing HMIS. If you're providing any type of homeless service, and definitely talk with the local government, your city, your county, other providers in the area. What does that look like? What would that look like, right? Like, think about what's the accurate count of who we actually know are experiencing homelessness. Make sure you've got your definitions right too, because a lot of times some communities, which I've heard over the years, they'll count people that maybe are coming to a space to get food, but maybe they aren't actually experiencing homelessness, or maybe they're living with family. They could be doubled up. That's not the literal definition of homelessness. It could be that they just have really low income. So let's get an accurate count and let's understand what that definition is. Let's work with our community members, our partners in the area. And then what would it look like? Because you'd have to start small. And the reason I say that is that if we just say, well, we have this huge community building and we can put in, 50 beds. Well, realistically, how are you going to have enough money to staff that many people? So we really have to look at who's going to partner on this. How can we start off with something small? Because if let's say you start off with a 10-bed shelter, and then your beds are constantly full and you're continually to serve more and more and more, you're going to then collect more and more data over time and then be able to expand if needed. So think of what would that look like in terms of the space? What would it look like in terms of staffing? How much money would we actually need? I would encourage them to reach out to me if they want to talk more about it, but really looking at how could we diversify funding. I think one of the number one things from new folks that want to start a shelter in their community is they think that this grant will fund the whole thing, and it won't. So you're really going to have to look at what other funding can be committed from the area, get staffing lined up, volunteers, and some communities start with a seasonal shelter. So they already start to put the work in, and they do provide some shelter over the winter months, let's say. And that's a good place to start, because then you're already starting to provide services, even if it's just part of the year. You're getting an accurate count of who needs it. You're working with other providers in the area. So you could start, if you wanted to start that way, you could. If you wanted to start year round, that's fine too. But it's just really important to get the data, figure out the funding, the partnerships, talk with me. I'm happy to talk with folks. And yeah, I think that's a good place to start.
And then just for anyone, if there is someone listening who is maybe curious about this process, maybe you've been tossing it around, shameless pitch. If you go to our website, that is wvceh.org, at the top, you will see a row of tabs. Go to funding opportunities. There will be a full breakdown and description of the fiscal year 2027 funding competition. You can click through and kind of read some of the information. We have some PDFs about the announcements, some of the different stipulations. Even if you're not planning to apply this year, it might be good context to read over some of that. Jess's email is linked on that same page, so you could reach out, ask any qualifying questions. But I think that might be a good place to get some written materials if this is something you're interested in. With all that said, Jess, thank you so much. I want to be cognitive of your time. For those of you who, this is going to be an audio platform, so you can't see us. Jess is actually at a conference right now and was so kind to take some time out of her day to come in and have this chat with us. So thank you, Jess, very much. I truly appreciate your time.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for talking with me.
Absolutely. And folks, if shelters are something that you're interested in, if this is a topic that you'd like to learn more about, connect with me. Let me know. Leave a comment. That way I know who I need to reach out to, who I need to interview. And if you're interested, I can probably get a few of the shelter directors on to kind of talk about the day-to-day and their experiences on their side of this. So with that, thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time. Hope you have a great day.